Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining in on time today. I have with me Miss Chitra. She is part of the Learner Confluence, and she is part of Dr. Senthil's team as well. Today, we have the pleasure to learn from her, know more from her. She will be taking the session, and her session should be around 45 minutes. And after that, she'll be taking the question answers from you all. You can put your questions in the chat box, or you can ask us towards the end. I'll let you all unmute. Thank you so much. I hope this will be a great learning session for all of us. Over to you, Chitra ma'am.
Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the session. Are you able to hear me?
Yes, ma'am, we can hear
Komal,
you.
are you able to hear me?
Yes, ma'am, we can hear you.
All
You
right.
can share the screen, ma'am.
Yeah, give me a moment and I'll share my screen. Are you able to see my screen?
Yes, ma'am, we can. It's clear.
All right. So let's begin. As we have very little time and there's a lot to cover, my presentation will be in 3 parts. In the first part, I will talk about why we need to relook at our assessment. The second part, I will take you through Bloom's taxonomy, all the 3 domains of Bloom's taxonomy. And in the third section, I will show you some examples of some different kinds of questions that you can ask. At the end of the presentation, you can ask questions and Komal will moderate that. Is that okay? Shall we begin? Okay, so today we are going to be looking at crafting questions and how we can move from lower order questions to higher order questions. So that's what we are going to be focusing on today. But before we get into that, although that's going to be a major part of today's session, before we get into it, I'll look at why we need to revamp our assessment practices. And I'll also briefly take you through the different domains of Bloom's taxonomy. Okay, these are some rules that we need to follow. This is a disclaimer. Whatever we say today is just for the purpose of learning, and it is not meant to demean or hurt any individual or institution, directly or indirectly. Whatever I'm going to be telling you will be suggestions that I will be giving, and you can use it the way you would like to in your school. These are some rules that we shall follow today. Please keep your mic in mute mode, and we'll take the questions only at the end. You can drop your questions in the chat box and Komal will direct it to me at the end of the presentation. Okay, now why do we need to take a relook at our assessments? So the National Education Policy 2020 is emphasizing on transforming assessments, and they're looking at regular formative and competency-based questions, competency-based assessments. The focus of assessment will be for learning, as learning, and off learning, and I'm going to be explaining that to you a little later. There will be a focus on higher order skills, and that's why towards the end of my presentation, I'm only going to be showing you questions based on higher order skills. We're going to be looking at how to improve and optimize learning, and the National Education Policy is looking at how to promote learning and development. And because of all this, we need to take another look at our assessments. What are we doing in our schools and how can we change it or how can we improve upon it? So the need for asking the right kinds of questions, because you need to know how assessment will be used. And then we're going to be looking at Bloom's. Now, what do we mean at assessment for learning? We're going to look at how we obtain information from students. So when they take an assessment, what information are we getting from students and how do we give them feedback? Looking at assessment as learning, The national education policy is looking at getting students involved in monitoring their own progress and self-assessment. I will look at that. I will take you through that when I show you the report cards that are going to be used. And assessment of learning, here we will look at how teachers can use assessment to look at how their students perform against standardized goals and uh, achievement tests. So there are three purposes for assessment. One is for learning. That is what we usually do to get information about how students are learning, to provide feedback, to improve upon our instruction practices. That is assessment for learning. Assessment as learning also involves students where they monitor their own progress. And assessment of learning is a tool that can be used by teachers to assess how their students have performed against certain learning goals and standards. So these are the three areas that the national education policy stresses upon. So there is going to be a transformation in the way report cards will be made in future. You will have to have 360-degree report cards where you will assess the cognitive domain as you are doing now, but also pay attention to the affective and the psychomotor domain. And assessments will be done by multiple people, not just by the teacher. So the teacher will be assessing. Along with this, there will be peer assessment, there will be parent assessment, there will be self-assessment. So if you look at what I said earlier, assessment as learning, this will be done by students. It is a self-assessment. So we'll have to change the way we are going to be assessing our students and also give them ample opportunity to monitor and assess themselves. So from traditional assessment practices where the teacher actually assessed the child, we're going to get into multidimensional assessment. And the policy also promotes a range of assessment techniques. So you will not be only assessing using pencil and paper, but you will also be assessing their projects. If they make a presentation, you can assess that. You will be assessing their classwork, their behavior in school. Parents will be assessing their children. So there will be assessment from different people that's going to be taking place. So this is going to be a transformation. The way we assess our students is going to change. Now, when we talk about this 360-degree report card and assessing children on the cognitive domain, affective domain, and the psychomotor domain, we also need to understand what this entails. And therefore, I will be taking you quickly through the Bloom's taxonomy. So I've told you what NEP 2020 is looking at, but this is what is happening currently. Okay. So are you really asking higher order questions? And what this survey actually found that 71% of the time we ask lower order questions, and the higher order questions we deal with very, very not so often. And there's not much emphasis on higher order questions. So you know what the NEP wants, but this is what is happening in practice. So there is a gap, and how do we address this gap? That is what we are going to be looking at. Now, what should we do? So we, as stakeholders, we have to bring about changes in the way we assess our students. So the school has to make a change. So we have 4 stakeholders here. The first one talks about the school. The second talks about the teacher. What changes should the teacher make? The third talks about the student. What changes should the student make? And the fourth one talks about parents. What changes should parents make? So all of us, all the stakeholders need to understand the changes that are going to be brought about in the way students will be assessed. So what should the school do? First, the school needs to define its examination policy. So as a school, if you don't have an examination policy, it's time to get one ready, because the NEP demands that the school needs to have an assessment policy. which is in line with whatever the NEP has said. Define the distribution of marks as per Bloom's taxonomy. So how are you going to distribute the marks as per Bloom's according to the different domains and as per the hierarchy in Bloom's taxonomy? Teachers will need to be trained in assessment techniques because not all teachers might know how to assess students in different ways. So teachers will require training in this particular area. All teachers will need to understand Bloom's taxonomy and put it to use. Results will have to be analyzed at different levels to see how good your students are in different skills. So that will have to be done, and then you will have to plan for improvement. Now, when I say plan for improvement, you will have to plan how you can improve your teaching learning practices and your assessment practices. As teachers, you will need to get trained. It's a good idea to start developing question banks. Collaborate with teachers of different subjects so that you can ask better kinds of questions. Communicate the changes in assessment patterns to both students and parents. It's important that they understand that there is a change, that there is a shift in the way that they are going to be assessed. Analyze results in terms of skills, not just how many have passed, how many have failed, how many have got below 50%. While you can continue to do that, you must also assess in terms of their skills. You need to develop rubrics to assess projects, etc., because we are looking at different assessment techniques. You'll need to define how you would wish to assess psychomotor and the affective domain. And you will also need to, along with your students, develop student portfolios because that is going to add to the assessment. As students will need to get trained to answer different kinds of questions. While they may be used to answering the certain kinds of questions, they may not be used to answering certain other kinds of questions. So they will have to be trained. They will have to the focus is going to be on concepts. Students will have to participate in self and peer evaluation. So they need to be trained on how to do that. They need to play an active role in developing their own portfolio. So you will need to train them on how they should start developing their portfolio, what should go into the portfolio, how to write reflections, etc. And they need to track their progress. So they need to understand their own strengths and weakness. The school will have to come up with mechanisms of how students can track their own progress. As parents will need to understand the changes in assessment patterns because they may be used to a certain kind, but now there's going to be a change. So they need to understand what is the change that will be taking place. They need to play an active role in actually assessing their own wards, and they need to help their children in developing their portfolio. So different stakeholders will have to play different roles. They have to get ready for this assessment. Now here you can see that there is a relationship between learning goals, the teaching learning activities, what you do in class, and the assessment. So one actually is related to the other, and nothing stands by itself. Very often what we observe is that there are certain learning outcomes, but the learning outcomes are not in any way related to the assessment, and sometimes the assessment does not reflect the teaching learning activities. So you must see how there is an alignment between these three major aspects in the classroom. That is, what are the objectives that you set? What are the teaching learning activities that you design? And how does this help in the assessment? And how does the assessment in itself give you feedback on whether you have achieved the learning outcomes? And if you've not achieved the learning outcomes, what are the changes that you will need to make in your teaching learning activities? So you must see whether there is an alignment between these three aspects when you look at your lesson plans, when you review the way you have taught something in class? Is there an alignment? Is there a mismatch between something? Is what you need to pay attention to. I'm sure all of you are aware of these three domains, that is the cognitive domain, the affective domain, and the psychomotor domain. Most of you must be very familiar with the cognitive domain because you use it all the time, especially when you write your learning outcomes. And I'm sure you also know a little bit about the affective and the psychomotor domain, but I don't know how well you are assessing it. But all these three aspects will have to be assessed if you want a 360-degree report card. So not just emphasis on the cognitive domain, but also equal emphasis on the affective and the psychomotor domain. We'll begin with the cognitive domain because this is where you do a lot of work. Now, cognitive domain is to do with intellectual skills. So the ability to recall and recognize facts, patterns, concepts, the ability to analyze information, all of this comes under the cognitive domain. And the cognitive domain has different levels. I'm sure you know this. So remember is at the bottom and create is at the top. Now, this is the revised Bloom's taxonomy. Earlier, what was remember called? What was remember earlier? Are you aware of the old taxonomy and the difference between the old and the new taxonomy? So earlier, remember was knowledge, comprehension, apply, analysis. Then it was synthesis and evaluation. Okay, now it has changed. So knowledge has changed to remember, comprehension is understand, then you have apply. Instead of analysis, it's analyze. Create and evaluate have shifted positions. So evaluate comes down and create is on top. Create is nothing but in the old system, it was called synthesis. Now it is called create. So this is how the Bloom's taxonomy has changed. Okay. So these are some verbs. I'm sure you are familiar with the verbs that are used at different levels. So in remember, you would say define something, repeat, list. Under understand, you would ask students to classify, describe, explain. Apply, you would ask students to demonstrate something or use it in a new situation. Analysis talks about actually breaking up a whole into its parts. Evaluate is to make judgment, and create is to come up with something new. Now let's go to the affective domain. The affective domain deals with feelings, values, motivation, attitudes. And just like the cognitive domain, it also has various categories. While the cognitive domain has 6 major categories, the affective domain has 5 major categories, and they are also arranged in hierarchy. So the simplest comes first, and the most complex comes at the top. Now, what's the simplest one in the affective domain? The simplest category in the affective domain is receiving. So in your report card, when you write comments like listens to others, etc., is there something that somebody wants to say?
Ma'am, you can go on. I muted everyone. Chitra, ma'am, you have to unmute and say that again. Sorry.
The simplest category in the affective domain is receiving. So when in your report card, when you say listens to others attentively, you are actually commenting about the affective domain. The next, after receiving, the next higher level is responding to phenomena. And many of you write comments about how the child participates in class, how the child asks questions or responds to ideas, etc. Again, you are commenting about the affective domain of the child. The third aspect is about how the child values diversity, how the child is sensitive to others, how the child demonstrates empathy. So this is about valuing. So it is the next higher level after responding to phenomena. After that, the next one is organization. And organization talks about how the child is able to balance freedom and responsible behavior, whether the child is able to accept responsibility for one's own behavior. All this is to do with organization. And finally, internalizing values looks at self-reliance in the workplace, whether the child is able to work independently, how the child cooperates in group activities, etc. So while you can assess these in your classroom, you also need to make room for the child to develop these skills. So how do you help the child develop or understand diversity? How do you help the child show empathy? So one is the assessment part of it. Along with it comes also how do you develop it through your lesson. So you need to do both, because if you don't bring in these aspects in your lesson, then you can't assess it. So how do you bring it into your lessons, and then how do you assess it? Do you have certain ways by which you observe the child and record the child against each of these categories? Do you have a rubric to actually assess the affective domain? Because our comments must be based on certain criteria that we observe, and therefore it would be good to have a rubric through which you can observe and write precise, accurate comments about the child in the area of the affective domain. The next we go into the psychomotor domain. As the name itself suggests, psychomotor is to do with physical movement, coordination, and the use of motor skills. Now, where do you assess the psychomotor domain? You can assess it in the playground, but you can also assess it in your class. You can assess it in other areas, like say a child is part of a theater club, or the child is part of dance. You can assess it there as well. You can also assess it in your labs, say where the child has to use equipment. Okay, the child has to show dexterity, precision, etc. So you can use it in your math class to see when the child uses manipulatives. How does the child use these manipulatives? Is there precision, speed? Is the child following certain technique, etc.? So the psychomotor domain need not be assessed only in the playground or only in the dance class or only in the theater class. It can be assessed in your regular classrooms, in the laboratories, in your math lab. When you have a role play that's done, you can assess the psychomotor skills of the child. Just like the cognitive and the affective domain, the psychomotor domain also has categories, and it has 7 major categories which are listed from simplest to the most complex. So perception is the simplest. So they're looking, and then I've given you an example. How does a child detect nonverbal cues, like estimate where a ball should be thrown, or estimate the puzzle that has to be picked up in order to complete the jigsaw puzzle, etc. So that is to do with perception. Readiness to act, looked at, so it is set. Set is the next category. Perception is the simplest, and above that comes set. So does the child know and act upon a sequence of steps to complete a certain psychomotor task? So if you tell the child to build a plane and then instructions are given, does the child follow instructions and act upon it in a sequence? Next is guided response. And here, how does the child actually imitate and follow instructions? So if the teacher shows the child how to use a scale, for example, where do you keep the zero to measure something? Does the child imitate that and follow? So that is guided response. So the teacher acts as the guide, the child imitates that and learns the skill by imitation, by trial and error. So it becomes very important that the teacher demonstrates and allows the child to actually imitate and learn. The next level is mechanism. Here, through trial and error, the child learns certain complex tasks and is able to perform it with some level of proficiency. For example, is the child able to use adjust the light in a microscope, focus a slide? All of these you can observe. So in the previous one, you might show the child how to do it. In the next one, you will measure whether the child is able to do it proficiently. Now, complex overt response is very similar to the previous one, very similar to mechanism, but here we will look at how accurate, how coordinated the performance is, etc. So how has the child actually become more proficient in the skill? Quicker, more accurate, more efficient. That is what we will.
Retirement has taken counseling.
Yeah. Then adaptation. So once the child is proficient in a skill, then the child can make, or a person can make modifications. So is the child, so once I've become proficient in something, am I able to make certain modifications, adapt it? So that is about adaptation. And the final one is origination. It is like the create level in the cognitive domain, where you make something new. So here, can the child create new movements, choreograph a dance, etc.? So origination in the psychomotor domain is very similar to the create level in the cognitive domain. So with this, I've given you a brief about the different domains of Bloom's taxonomy, that is the cognitive domain, the affective domain, and the psychomotor domain. Now we will focus on the cognitive domain, because we are going to be looking at how can you craft questions. So we are going to be focusing largely on the cognitive domain. Okay. So what are these higher order questions? Everyone talks about HOTS and LOTS. But what is HOTS? So HOTS are questions that the student cannot answer by simple recollection. So something has been taught in class or something is given in the textbook. And if you ask a question where the child has to just recall that information, it does not become a higher order question. So the higher order questions actually put a higher cognitive demand on students. The thinking process, the thought process that is involved in answering the question. So there is a higher cognitive demand. It encourages students to think beyond literal questions. It promotes critical thinking, problem solving. It requires students to transfer knowledge that is learnt either in one subject or one chapter to another context, or a new chapter or a new subject or a different subject. Okay. And it requires students to use old ideas to create new ones. And I'm going to be giving you examples of these. So research says that when you ask higher order questions, you are actually promoting neural branching. That is, you're promoting the brain to make more neural connections. and therefore helping the child in divergent thinking or lateral thinking. But if we confine our questions to just the lower order questions, just recall and understand, then the tendency of the brain to fit into certain patterns will occur, and this is called as neural pruning. So as we move, if we want our children to have these 21st century skills like critical thinking, creativity, problem solving, then we will need to increase the kind of the higher order questions so that we increase neural branching. Now, what are the strategies that we can use to encourage higher order thinking? Now, this is where we are going to get into how do we craft different kinds of questions. Whatever I told you until now was just a background, but here we are going to get into the actual process of crafting different kinds of questions. So one thing that you can use is application of different symbol systems. So whatever is given in textual form, you can turn it into a diagram and see whether students can answer those questions, or ask students to turn whatever textual form into a diagram. That is one way of doing it. You could use analogies, and I'll show you some examples. You could integrate different subject areas. Very often, teachers work in silos. So if it's a math teacher, it will be confined only to mathematics. The questions will be confined only to mathematics. But can you integrate mathematics with other subject areas? Because that will also allow the child to transfer what she or he has learned in one subject to another subject. Encourage hypothetical thinking. I'll show you some examples of how you can do it. Encourage reversal thinking. If you give the effect, find out what could be the causes. And analysis of a point of view. So that can also be encouraged. I think as I take you through examples, you will understand these things better. Okay, now these are some lower order questions, right? List the physical properties of metals. The formation of copper oxide from copper in the presence of oxygen as a dash reaction. You have to just recall. Or how does copper react with carbon dioxide present in the air? Why does copper turn green? These are some lower order questions. Now, how do we turn these lower order questions into higher order questions? What can we do? Now, let me show you an example. Now, here I've taken an example of the Titanic. You can read it. So the Titanic, the largest steamship in the world, at that time was built in Belfast in 1912. It was constructed from thousands of steel plates and iron rivets. She was supposed to be virtually unsinkable. It is now over 100 years since the ship collided with an iceberg and sank on her maiden journey across the Atlantic. Scientists have recovered rivets from the wreckage and measured unusually high levels of slag. And I've given what it is. And slag contains oxides of iron and silicon dioxide. Now, here is the question. Metal workers pounded the rivets of the Titanic using noisy hydraulic hammers. According to one theory, had this been done by hand, the workers would have realized that the rivets were not of good quality. How could the metal workers have detected this using the physical properties of metals? Okay, so this becomes an analysis question, and this will require the child to actually think through what it is rather than just listing the properties of metal. So do you see the difference between the question of list the properties of metals to what is being asked here? Let me show you another question. So a piece of steel from the Titanic was tested at the Defense Research Establishment, Atlantic. That's the name of the organization. When the impact test, that is, it was beaten with a hammer, was conducted on the steel recovered from the Titanic, it behaved like glass. So imagine that these are two pieces of the same dimensions show how they behave when they are hammered. So imagine that the first block you see is from the Titanic, and the second block is a piece of steel, okay, from the laboratory. How will they behave when they are hammered? So again, it is to do with the properties of metals, and you can show how they behave. So instead of asking about ductility directly, what is ductility? You can ask questions like this. Now, this picture shows the Titanic. This was photographed in 2004, approximately 92 years after it sank. I'll show you the next images. Images B and C are that of the Statue of Liberty, and I've explained what it is over here. You can take a minute to read it, and then I'll move on. Okay, predict the color of the Statue of Unity after 100 years. Had the statue been installed in the Thar Desert, would the results be different? Explain. So it becomes an analysis question. Basically, we are talking about the reaction of metals with carbon dioxide that's present in the air. So instead of directly asking how does copper react with carbon dioxide that's present in the air, you could change the way you actually ask the question. Okay. Another example here, draw a neatly labeled diagram of the heart, explain the functions and different parts of the heart. These are the lower order questions. Now, how do you turn them into higher order questions? Take a look at this example. In a hospital in Delhi, there are two newborn babies with different heart problems. Baby A has a hole between the right and left ventricles of the heart called ventricular septal disease. Baby B has a condition where the origin of the aorta and the pulmonary artery are interchanged, a condition known as the transposition of the great vessels. Illustrate both conditions using diagrams. So students know what the heart, the diagram of the heart. Now they have to use what is given here to show what has changed. Then you can ask questions like what are the possible symptoms of condition A and condition B, and which of the above two conditions is more severe and requires immediate treatment. Now that becomes an evaluate question. So instead of just asking about the functions of the heart, draw a label diagram of the heart, which becomes a lower order level question. You could also ask these kinds of questions, which will put a higher cognitive demand on the child. Again, these are two lower level questions. How do metals react with acids? Which gas is produced when a metal higher in the reactivity series reacts with an acid? What is corrosion? All of them look at the lower order levels. Remember and understand. Now, how do you turn these into higher order questions? So here are some examples. Now here I'm trying to integrate different subject areas. So how do we integrate chemistry with history? So the Iron Age was a period in human history that started between 1200 BCE and 600 BCE, depending on the region. The Iron Age was preceded by the Stone Age and the Bronze Age. During the Iron Age, people across much of Europe, Asia, and parts of Africa began to make tools and weapons from iron and steel. And I've given you the reactivity series of metals as well as metals and their melting points. And now the questions: why did the Bronze Age precede the Iron Age? Okay, so that becomes analysis. And then with the discovery of fire and advent of agriculture, early people began to store, preserve, and cook different kinds of food. Imagine that you belong to the Iron Age. You have 4 different vessels, A, B, C, D. A is made of clay, B is made of copper, C is made of bronze, and D is made of iron. You have these following dishes, MNOP. M is rice, N is rasam, and I've said what are its ingredients. O is curd, and P is dried millets. Which vessel is suitable to store all 4 food items? You need to explain. And which vessel or vessels are not at all suitable to store curd? Okay, so again, you have to analyze reactions of metals with acids and then come up with an answer. So this becomes an evaluate level question. We'll go into physics. So these are some lower order questions. I'm sure we ask these questions all the time. How are shadows formed? What are shadows? What kinds of objects will cast shadows? When will shadows be the shortest, etc. Now let's see how we can ask higher order questions based on the same concept. So a lit candle is casting a shadow on the wall. How will you make the shadow disappear? Write your idea here. So that becomes a create question. Okay. Now here, Aditya has been accused of robbery. He says that at the time of the robbery, which occurred at 9 a.m. the previous day, he was at a bus stop near the city's lighthouse and has a photograph to prove it. Study the photograph and say whether Aditya is lying or not. So instead of asking questions like, when will shadows be the shortest or when will shadows be the longest, you can turn it around and ask such questions. And this becomes an evaluate level question because you're making a judgment whether Aditya is lying or not. Okay, here you have to arrange these objects in such a way that only the shadow of the rock is visible on the screen. And all objects must be in a straight line. So there are 4 objects given. How will you arrange it such that only the object of the rock is shown on the screen? So it becomes an analysis question. Now here you have to identify which of these are shadows and which of these are reflections and why do you say so? So you have a photograph here. You have both shadows and reflections. Which of these are shadows? Which of these are reflections? And you need to give your reason. So again, it becomes analysis. Okay, allow students to think like scientists. For example, can they design an experiment? So an apple a day keeps the doctor away is an oft-heard saying. Design an experiment to test whether this is true. So this makes students think about what are the variables that are involved, what are the dependent variables, what are the independent variables, how do you design a simple experiment? So get students to think. There is a higher cognitive demand here. The next one asks students to actually create a flow chart based on properties of different things like metal, paper, glass, and garbage to separate them into 4 different parts. Another way of getting children to think is to ask them to come up with a hypothesis. So a table is given. They have to study the table and come up with a hypothesis. And coming up with a hypothesis is a create level question. So they study the table and they can come up with a hypothesis. So again, it becomes a higher order level question where students need to create something. Okay. Again, we look at some lower order questions. How do polar bears survive in polar regions? Describe adaptations of polar bears. Explain the structure of a gill, etc. Now, how do we change this into higher order questions? What we can do is also use analogies. If you remember in the beginning, I told you analogies is another strategy that we can use to actually craft good questions to turn lower order questions into higher order questions. So this is one way by which you can use analogy to actually ask a question. So a thermos flask keeps something hot or cold for a long time. This is because of the vacuum that is present between the inner and outer wall of the flask. This analogy can be used to explain the function of which body part given below. Again, these are some lower order questions. What is osmosis? Explain the movement of water molecules through a semi-permeable membrane, or explain the function of xylem and phloem. All lower order questions that we would generally ask. Now, how do we change it using an analogy into a higher order question? So imagine a crowded room with people moving in and out through a partially open door. How does the process of osmosis resemble this scenario? What factors determine the net movement of water molecules across the membrane? So you're using an analogy of a crowded room with people moving in and out, and you're relating it to osmosis. Similarly, the next question is talking about transport in a tree, transport of food and water in a tree. So think of a tree as a complex network of roads. What would be the equivalent of roads in a tree? How do the roads differ in terms of substances they transport? What will be the directions of movement? So in both cases, we've used analogy to turn a lower order question into a higher order question. Which respiratory organ resembles this musical instrument? So again, you can use pictures. Now, these are two lower order questions. For example, explain the process of breathing, explain the systemic and pulmonary circulation. And you can turn it into a higher order question by using diagrams. And it will also help you understand certain misconceptions that students have. So which of these diagrams represents the process of breathing? Is it 1, 2, A, B, C, or D? And the legend is given as to oxygen, nitrogen, carbon dioxide, and other gases. So students have to analyze all the pictures and choose the right answer. So this becomes an analysis question. So instead of just asking students explain the process of breathing, you can turn it around and give these kinds of pictures and ask questions. Which diagram best represents the relationship between the circulatory and the respiratory system? Explain. So there are 4 diagrams here. Students have to choose the right one and then explain as to why they chose that, and explain the relationship between the circulatory system and the respiratory system. You could use reversal thinking. In the beginning, I told you this is another strategy that you can use to turn lower order questions into higher order questions. So students learn how cockroaches, fish, frogs, etc. breathe. So if all of these are dropped into water, which one is likely to say, I cannot breathe? Again, reversal thinking, where you've given data in the form of a table and asked which substance underwent both physical and chemical changes. Instead of just asking children to define physical and chemical changes, you can give a table and then ask students which did substance 1, 2, 3, or 4 undergo both physical and chemical changes. Now let's look at a few questions. I've taken you through lots of questions in sciences. Let's look at a few questions in social sciences. So these are some lower order questions. I've taken 2 chapters basically. One is on World War II and the other is on India's struggle for independence. So this is on World War II. These are some lower order questions that we would usually ask. So can you name the major Axis powers and Allied powers during World War II? What were the key factors that contributed to the outbreak of World War II? And how did they differ from the causes of World War I? How did the Treaty of Versailles and its punitive terms for Germany set the stage for events leading up to World War II? So basically, at the understand level, how do we change them to higher order questions? So what if United States had not entered World War II after the attack on Pearl Harbor? How might the course and outcome of the war have been different? So it becomes a create question. To what extent did the Allied bombing campaigns against the Axis powers during World War II achieve their objectives and contribute to the ultimate Allied victory? So it becomes an evaluate question. You can also ask an analysis question. If World War II were a giant puzzle, which countries or alliances would be the key pieces? And what pivotal events fit those pieces together to form a complete picture of the war's outcome? Students can use blocks and arrows to show how this puzzle actually fits together. Another question, what are the major turning points of World War II? How did these major turning points shape the course of the war and its ultimate outcome? You can also ask create questions. So if you're a journalist reporting a significant event, the student can choose any one event, describe the event, your role as a journalist, and the impact your reporting might have on public perception and understanding of the war. So it becomes a create question. So from lower order questions that we ask, we could also ask higher order questions using the same concept. Again, this is to do with India's struggle for independence. So these are some lower order questions. What are the main reasons behind the decision to divide the country? Or what role did the nonviolent resistance and civil disobedience movement play in the Indian independence? Then explain the significance of leaders, various leaders who participated in India's struggle for independence. So these are some lower order questions, mainly at the understand level. And how do we ask higher order questions? So what might have been the outcome for India's struggle for independence if Mahatma Gandhi had not emerged as a prominent leader? So how could the trajectory of the movement and India's history have been different? So this will involve higher order thinking because children have to now think of a hypothetical situation and then write an answer. The next question is an analyze question. Analyze the various strategies and tactics employed by different leaders and groups during India's struggle for independence. So we knew there was a nonviolent movement, but along with that, there were other movements as well. So there were different tactics used by different people. Which approaches were most successful and why did they succeed? To what extent did the nonviolent civil disobedience as championed by Gandhi contribute to the success of India's struggle for independence? And what were the key factors that made it effective? So again, you are evaluating the extent to which the nonviolent civil disobedience movement actually helped in achieving the desired outcome. Okay, so I've taken you through some questions in science and some questions in social studies. So let's look at these questions. This is for you to think about what kinds of questions are these. Do you believe that bottled water is better than tap water? What is the basis of your belief? Why do you not treat water as a precious resource? Do humans play a constructive part in the water cycle? Alfred Tennyson in his poem, The Brook, says, men may come and men may go, but I go on forever. Does this really hold true? Think about what kinds of questions these are. So with that, I end my presentation and I will take questions. Komal, you can moderate.
Yes, thank you, Chitra ma'am. That was a wonderful session and very insightful. So anyone, if you want to unmute and ask the question, please do that. And in case if you want to type it in the message box, I can read it for you. So please go ahead and type your questions in the chat box, or you can raise your hand and come and ask for yourself on the screen. Chitra ma'am, you could stop sharing your screen.
Okay.
I think once one person asks the question, the ball will go rolling. So looking for the first representation to ask the question, because that will really enrich the discussion that we had till now.
Please go ahead and ask your questions.
Ma'am, we have comments like wonderful techniques of crafting. Thank you. It was very insightful. We also
Okay.
need a few English subject questions.
Yes, I know because of paucity of time, I restricted the examples that I gave you to just 2 subjects. Maybe if there was a little more time, we could have dealt with other subjects as well. But whatever techniques I've shown you, like say, asking hypothetical questions, using analogies, using reversal thinking, asking create questions, you could use it in any subject. They're not subject specific. So whatever I've shown you in science and in social science can be used in English as well. Can't hear
Ma'am,
you,
there is a
Komal.
question. There is a
Yeah.
question that is it important to use HOQ in every question, in every worksheet we provide?
I didn't understand what is HOQ.
Higher order, ma'am, I think they wanted to write HOTS,
Okay. Okay.
So is it important to use HOTS in every worksheet? I think we need to use a mixture of all in one sheet. And what percentage of HOTS questions should be asked? If,
Okay.
yeah,
Go ahead. Please go ahead.
ma'am, that is the question that should
Okay.
we use HOTS in the every worksheet? If not, then what is the percentage of HOTS should be used?
Okay. Now, if you want to train your students to answer HOTS questions, the higher order thinking questions, then it is good to introduce it in your classrooms, not just in the assessments. So if you're going to be using worksheets in your classrooms, introduce 1 or 2 questions at least so that students slowly begin to learn how to answer those questions. If you only ask it in your summative examination, then students will find it very difficult. They will not know how to answer such questions, how to tackle those questions. Now, what percentage that you will have to decide, because you know your class best, how do they have exposure to higher level thinking questions? If they have exposure to higher level thinking questions, then you could ask more of those. But however, if you've not introduced these questions, then begin slowly. Don't suddenly ask a lot of higher level thinking questions, because students will really struggle. And introduce these questions as part of your teaching learning strategies. That means you write some of these questions on the board, think aloud, so that students understand your own thought process in answering these questions. They need to understand how the teacher thinks in order to answer these questions. So you'll have to demonstrate this to the students.
Ma'am, the next question is that how can we inculcate peer-to-peer assessments? Peer-to-peer assessment can be inculcated in our assessment. Can you suggest how peer-to-peer assessment can be inculcated in our assessment?
Okay. First of all, develop a rubric for peer assessment. Then demonstrate this with another teacher of yours. So both of you act like students, show how you are going to assess. So imagine that you or another teacher of yours, you are assessing a project. Okay, so you are assessing the project of your peer. And look at the criteria that's given in the rubric and say how you will mark it. So you need to demonstrate the whole thing, and you also need to develop a rubric for it.
Sure, ma'am. Sunita, ma'am, you can unmute yourself and please ask the question. Sunita, ma'am.
Namaste, Chitra ma'am.
Namaste.
Ma'am, although we would train the children in the class on hot questions, but my query here is definitely the same thing we would not be able to repeat it in the assessment. So that doesn't make sense, right?
Yeah, right.
So, how possible is it for senior secondary students to give hot questions, ma'am? Because the time constraint is like a 3 hours paper. So, can you just throw a little bit light on that? Because I'm a bit confused with the time
Okay.
constraint when they have to answer, create, or analyze questions.
I think now your CBSE paper is also going to bring in these kinds of questions. The last section that I have seen, that is section E, there are a lot of context-based questions where some of those questions are HOTS questions. So you will have to train them in class to actually answer these questions. Only then they can use it. Answer these questions in the CBSE paper as well. And I would say begin young. Don't wait till they come to 9th standard or 10th standard to introduce HOTS questions. You can start early.
Okay, thank you.
And it need
Ma'am,
not
there's a
always be writing. Even young children, when you tell them a story, you can ask, which character did you like? Why did you like the character the most? If you were in that character's place, what would you do? So it can be oral as well. It need not always be written.
Yeah.
ma'am, the
Okay.
next question is the question where Titanic was mentioned. Can we get to see that slide again? There was one word, hydraulics. Will the student be able to understand the question as they may or may not know the process of using hydraulics?
Okay. You can see the question again, but the emphasis was not so much on hydraulics, but it was on the noisy hammer that was used. Okay, the emphasis was more that the hammer that was used was very noisy, and had metal workers actually done it by hand, they would have realized that there was something wrong with the rivets. So the emphasis was on something else. Yeah.
Ma'am, the next question is, my question is, how many questions should we include for grade 4 and grade 3 children? Minimum number of questions.
That will depend on the time that is given for students to answer the paper. It will also depend on your class. I cannot tell you that you must have 50% of this and 30% of something else. You know your students well, what they are capable of, what are their abilities, and depending on that, you will need to frame your questions. But try to include at least one or two HOTS level question, and gradually you can increase it. You'll also need, I'm sure every class is mixed. You will have some students who can answer these questions, some students who may struggle. So you'll need to have a mix of different kinds of questions. And it'll all depend on your class.
And the next question is, my question is, how can parent contribute in assessment and portfolio of a student if the parents are not able to do it due to their limitations?
I'm not sure what limitations you are talking about, but there are certain activities that the child does at home. The parent also will understand what is it that the child is interested in, what kinds of books the child may read at home, what are the other hobbies that the child has. So the parents can give that input which goes into the portfolio, because these are aspects that the teacher may not be aware of. And maybe one limitation that I see is maybe they are not very good. They will not be able to write it in English. But even if they write it in the mother tongue, or they tell the teacher and the teacher is able to write it and put it down, that also contributes to the portfolio. If,
Ma'am, there's a
if
question.
language is a limitation, let the parent put it in the regional language. because the portfolio is actually intended to look at those aspects that cannot be measured in your report card or during school hours. Yet there are a lot of things that the child engages in after school hours. So that also needs to come into the portfolio, and that's where parents can play a very constructive role.
Ma'am, the next question is if you could state any example for lower and higher order for economics.
Offhand, I'm not able to do it, but if you share your email ID, I will definitely send you some questions.
Kavita ma'am, Anju ma'am, you're on camera. Would you like ask any questions?
You can share your email ID with Komal and also share the topics that you are looking at, and I will go through the topic and send you some questions. I'll definitely do that.
Good evening,
Request
Chitra ma'am.
anyone
It was
whose
nice
question.
session. It was wonderful session. And I totally agree that now we have opportunity to work upon as the resource-based questions are included in CBSE. That is the best way to inculcate, and give practice to children using those questions and creating high order questions there. So that is the best possible way we can, just start practicing from middle classes. Why to wait for 9th and 10th? That's absolutely true. Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you.
Good evening, Chitra
Ma'am.
ma'am.
Good evening.
Good evening, Chitra ma'am. I really loved the kind of questions and how you compared, okay, a list of lower order questions and the same questions, how they can be. Can you share these with us through mail?
I will have to get permission.
Right.
Okay.
Chitra ma'am, we can share the presentation with them.
Yeah.
We can share the presentation.
Because we want to share it with our teachers. Okay.
Sure. Yeah.
This is such a ready resource. So where we can show, see, these are because this is what we see usually, and especially in City Montessori School, we have changed quite a lot as far as the lower classes are concerned. Class 3 to 8, we are into higher order questions in a big way. But senior classes, it is very difficult to break the thought process of the teachers. They still refer to the board. Board does not ask such kind of questions. Why should we frame? Okay, so it's very difficult. It's a struggle. So we actually need to share it with them.
Sure, ma'am.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Anju ma'am, please go ahead.
Good evening, ma'am. Good evening, Chitra ma'am.
Good evening, ma'am.
It was a wonderful session, and we already had a few workshops for the senior section, and they were also very informative. But I was just seeing I've taken some screenshots also, the case study questions. Actually, the problem is, ma'am, the books which we follow in the senior curriculum, they are not devised that way till now, that assertion and case study questions, because the format of the case study, sometimes it becomes very long case study, and it is very difficult to connect for the students. So how do we go about like what type of questions to be included in the book? Because in textbook, they are not being reflected that way. We are having mostly traditional questions.
That's
but
true.
we are framing, when we are making the worksheets through your training programs, we are trained a little bit to make such kind of worksheets which can benefit students. But I think we need more guidance on assertion and case study questions. So if you can. Thank you so much.
I agree that the textbooks are not framed that way. The textbooks largely have the traditional kinds of questions, largely focus on the lower order level questions. But what I saw in the sample CBSE papers is that the last section, section E, are actually case study or context-based questions, etc. So I think teachers will have to put in that extra effort, try to frame these questions. Some of the context-based questions are long. We can refine it further, try to remove all unnecessary words, things that are not required, and try to reduce the length of the context itself so that students don't spend too much time reading the context itself. However, we also need to prepare the students for this, because unless we train the students, they will not be ready to answer such questions. And
Right.
that's why I said teachers should not work in silos. They must collaborate with each other, understand what is going on in another subject area, because that's how you can integrate it. That's how you can write good context-based questions. Because if you understand what is being taught in another subject, you could include that here as well and then write your questions. That will help the teacher. So I think getting different subject teachers to sit together, understand what is being taught in each other's classes would really help the teachers.
Absolutely. Thank you, ma'am.
Yes.
Good evening, ma'am.
Good evening.
Myself, Abhishek Bajpayee from KDRFS.
Good evening, sir.
Yes, madam. I am a physics teacher. Actually, the problem we are facing designing of the questions during that, actually, in case of 10th science, if we are designing the separate for the physics, for chemistry and bio. So
Yeah.
for the physics portion, madam, if we are designing like, analytical question, like you were giving the example of 1 mark question, like state, suppose if we are using the define word, define flotation or define Ohm's law. So we have to use something in the language. So in case of madam 1 mark or 2 mark question, if we are making a question and if the theoretical part means explanation of the question, explanation part of the question is so long, so how students will manage the time? Sometimes we have get the same query from the students also. Ki the paper was so lengthy. Sometimes I am reading or I have to give the answer. So this is the problem we are facing, madam. What is the solution of it?
Okay, if I see the papers, the board papers, I find that the first section are largely 1 mark questions where the question itself is short. I find these context-based questions coming only towards the end of the paper in section E where the context is asked. So there is a little more of reading to be done. 2 things that you will need to do is one is improve the reading skill. Okay, because if there are these context-based questions, then students will need to read and understand that. So reading skills have to be improved. And otherwise students will struggle with actually reading the question and understanding the question. Generally, the answers are not very long. The answers are quite short. Although the students may have to spend some time reading it, when they have to write the answers are quite short. They're not very long answers.
One more thing, madam. Suppose
Yes.
if usually we are the teachers, means physics, we are collaborative teachers. So we are using deduce, elaborate, state in 1 mark question, the definition or something. So is it okay, madam, to use state because it's a direct question, state flotation or state Ohm's law? So we can use it, or we have to make more like informative or something.
Not really. Your papers must be a mix of both lots and hots. So lower order questions as well as higher order questions.
Okay.
It is
Okay.
not only higher order questions that should be in your paper. The purpose of this presentation was to actually show how you could also ask higher order questions, not ask just higher order questions. So I want to
Okay.
clarify that. Yeah.
Yes, madam. Thank you, madam.
Okay. Thank you, sir.
Thank you so much, Chitra ma'am. Thank you for your
Thank you.
time and for a very informative session. Everyone in the audience, if you all have any questions anymore you would want Chitra ma'am to answer, please mail us and we'll try and revert to you with the answer shortly. We will have our next session on 14th of December. We have shared the detail. We'll again share with you. And on 24th of November, we have a session from OECD as well. We'll be sharing the details with you. Thank you so much for being such an active participants today. Thank you once again, Chitra ma'am. And we hope to have continuously learning series with all the teachers and leaders of the participant schools. Thank you so much. Happy Diwali to everyone. Have a great festival. Have a great festive time and enjoy the festival. Thank you so much.
Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you,
Could you please share email ID, ma'am, where you want us to just mail you the
All your school POC have my email ID and my contact number. You can take it from them. It is komal@excelone.in. So I'll just put it on the chat box as well for you all.
yeah, that would be
And
great.
yes, and we will be sharing the recording of the sessions with you all as well. So it will be there. Thank you so much,
Thank you.
everyone. Have a great
Thank you,
festive time.
everyone.
Happy
Happy
Diwali,
Diwali.
everyone.